Mice and Mystics, Book 1, Sorrow and Remembrance, Prologue, Bedtime for Tip. Daz Bellows gave his son a stern wag of the finger. "Into bed with you, boy," he said gruffly. Little Tip gave a hefty yawn and a stretch, and then climbed into his straw nest, his tail curling around him. Outside the tree, the wind was howling and the snow was forming mounds. But inside it was warm and dry, and Daz tucked Tip in with a thick blanket. "That's my lad," he said softly, and fluffed the scruffy fur between Tip's mouse ears. "Dream of spring and pretty things that bloom." He turned to blow out the enormous candle that stood in the corner of the bedroom, but Tip sat up. "Don't leave yet, Papa," he said. "The wind is fearsome tonight. Stay with me and tell me a story." Daz arched an eyebrow. "A story, eh? And which one do you have in mind?" Tip's tail twitched with excitement. "Tell me the story of brave Prince Colin in the kingdom of men." Daz chuckled and settled into the walnut shell rocker that sat near the nest. Candlelight danced over the face of his excited son. "Very well, mouseling," he sighed. "Lay back and I shall tell it. Our story begins with a young human whose age was not dissimilar to your own. But the story does not begin in winter, oh no. It begins in a rich and beautiful summer." And so Daz began the story, reciting it word for word with all the proper flourish, just as it had been told to him by his own pap many nights ago. "Once upon a time there was a kingdom of men, and it was ruled by a good King Andon. King Andon was a kind and generous man and loved by all his people. But he was lonely as well, for he had to raise his son, Prince Colin, all alone. Prince Colin had grown into a fine young man, and the king was very proud of him, yet the king missed his queen, who had passed away many years ago. King Andon spent much of his time with his advisors, and together they decided on how to best rule the kingdom and protect its people. They would order the construction of important buildings, ensure that food was plentiful, and forge alliances with neighbouring lands such as wealthy Nextor. But one summer day, a visitor from a faraway land arrived at the castle. She was heralded by dark skies and a chill wind. She was Venestra, beautiful queen of an unheard land called Darkenland. She had travelled with a contingent of several hundred soldiers dressed in jet-black mail, and she was escorted by King Andon's long-time friend, a pointy-faced man with a curiously curled mustache named Captain Verst. Verst claimed to have met the queen during his travels, and insisted she come to meet the king. Venestra's visit seemed to lift King Andon's melancholy, and for this everyone in the castle was grateful. A mere fortnight after her arrival, King Andon proclaimed his love for Venestra. Colin and the king's advisors found this troubling. The following week, the king announced his intentions to marry Venestra. Colin and the king's advisors found this even more troubling. The marriage announcement brought dark days with it, and King Andon fell ill. His malady was mild at first, little more than a raspy cough and fatigue. But soon he paled and could not leave his bed. Tilda, the castle's healer, used all the arts at her disposal, but no remedy that she knew of could relieve the king. She could only shake her head and say, "There is something strange afoot." As the king's illness grew, he began to struggle with even ruling from his bedchamber, and so he began to pass authority to Venestra. The Dark Queen put Captain Verst in charge of the house guard, and he replaced most of the garrison with Venestra's own cruel soldiers, men who bullied and bothered the household staff. Soon most of the staff had fled the castle, save for those such as kindly Miss Maggie the cook. At night, strange voices echoed down the empty castle hallways, and Miss Maggie could only shake her head and say, "There is something strange afoot." During the day, Venestra could be seen gliding through the castle, scolding her soldiers, who seemed able to do little more than brawl and break things. The queen spent much time visiting the castle's forge, from which came the sounds of hammering and hissing steam. Maginot, the castle's mystic, would stroke his beard and say, "There is something strange afoot." Soon Prince Colin could take no more, and so he summoned the king's closest advisers to a secret council in Maginot's laboratory. Burly Nez Bellows, the tinkerer, was there, newly evicted from the forge where he had toiled for many years. Tilda the healer was there, as well as old Maginot himself, he who had served Colin's family for generations. Together the four had hatched a plan to drive Venestra and her men from the castle and back to whatever terrible land they had come from. But they were too late. The doors to the laboratory were kicked open, and there stood Captain Verst and a great many of his guard. The four were arrested for conspiring against the king, and Captain Verst smiled cruelly when they were thrown into the castle dungeons alongside the worst scamps the kingdom had to offer. When they had been left alone, only Maginot seemed undeterred. He linked his fingers in a strange way, puffed up his chest, and blew into his hands. He let loose a high whistle, and a few minutes later the whistle was answered by the appearance of his pet, Meeps, the tiny ruby-red dragon. Meeps flew in unseen, high above the heads of the guards, and he flitted through the bars and landed on Maginot's hands. In his little jaws was a single strand of jet-black hair. Maginot patted Meeps on the head and held the hair aloft for all to see. "This is a strand of Venestra's hair," he told them. "She is clearly a magical being of great power. This hair contains enough energy to allow us to transform, thus enabling our escape. But what mundane creatures should we change into? Whatever it is, we will have no means of turning ourselves back." Colin and his companions fell silent, unhappy at the prospect of not being humans. "Mice," said a voice from the shadows. It was Flitch, the notorious thief. He had spent most of his life robbing the good people of the kingdom until King Andon's sheriffs had finally caught him. He now shared their cell. "We could escape the sewers from here," he said, pointing to a small grate on the flagstone floor in the nearby room. "No one asked you, scamp," growled Nez. Suddenly there was a noise from the guard-room. "There is no time for argument," shouted Maginot. He waved his free hand over Venestra's hair, muttering ancient words that time has long since forgotten. Glowing motes of blue light fell from the hair as if they were water, and they began to swirl along the floor as if blown by unseen gusts. Soon the jail cell was filled with a brilliant maelstrom of supernatural power, and then, without warning, it burst and vanished. And where there had been 5 prisoners in the cell, there were now but 5 tiny mice. "Well, bother!" squeaked Nez.